I want to tell you about a dinner, not a dramatic one. No one screamed, no one threw anything, no one said a single word that would make the headlines of anyone's life. It was a Tuesday in November, and the kitchen smelled like rosemary and something sweet, and a man named Lace Ellis refilled his daughter's water glass without her asking, without looking up from what he was saying. Just reached over, poured, kept talking. And his daughter didn't say thank you because she didn't have to, because this was just what happened in that house. It was just the air they moved through, and nobody thought it was remarkable. I thought I was going to pass out. I'm not exaggerating. I felt the room go slightly sideways. I felt something shift behind my sternum, not pain exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize you've been holding your breath and didn't know it. I was 22 years old. I was sitting at a stranger's dinner table in Millbrook, eating pot roast I hadn't been asked if I wanted, and I was watching a completely ordinary family be completely ordinary with each other, and something in me, something I didn't have a name for yet, cracked wide open. I didn't speak for almost an hour after that, not because anything bad happened, because something good did, and I didn't know how to be in the presence of it. This is the story of what that dinner showed me. About that family, yes, but mostly about mine. My name is Ren. I grew up in Millbrook, medium-sized city, mid-sized problems, the kind of place where everyone knows the shape of everyone else's life, but not the inside of it. I grew up in a beige house on a street with too many beige houses, with two parents named Loretta and Vernon, and an older brother named Garrett, and from the outside, I'm sure we looked completely fine. We had dinner together most nights. We went to church on Sundays. My mother baked. My father coached my brother's little league for 3 seasons before his knee gave out. We took a vacation to the coast when I was 9, and I have a photo from that trip where all 4 of us are smiling and the ocean is behind us, and you would look at that photo and think, that's a family. That's a whole normal fine family. I looked at that photo recently. I was going through a box of things I'd kept from childhood, the kind of sorting you do when you're trying to decide what to carry forward and what to finally set down. I found that photo, and I held it for a while, and I thought about how strange it is that a single image can be true and completely misleading at the same time. We were there, we were smiling. The ocean was real. And also, and this is the part the photo doesn't show, I had spent the entire drive to the coast afraid to say anything because my mother had woken up that morning in what she called a mood, which was the word we used in our house for something that didn't have a safer name. And the rule when Loretta was in a mood was simple: be invisible, take up no space, make no requests, laugh only if she laughs first. I was 9 years old and I already knew those rules by heart. That's the thing about the families we grow up in. They teach us things before we're old enough to question whether those things are true. They hand us a map of the world before we've ever seen the world. And we use that map. We navigate by it. We assume it's accurate because it's the only map we have. And then one day, maybe at 22, maybe sitting in a stranger's kitchen in November, watching a man refill a water glass, you look up from your map and realize, this isn't the territory. This was never the territory. The map was wrong. That's what that dinner did to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back. Let me tell you who Loretta and Vernon were, and what life inside their house actually felt like. So that when I tell you about Ellis and June and their daughter Mara, you understand what I was measuring it against. Loretta was beautiful. I want to say that first because I think it matters. It shaped things. She was the kind of beautiful that people commented on, the kind that got her things, the kind she knew how to use and sometimes resented needing. She had this stillness to her that people mistook for grace. She could sit in a room and say nothing, and everyone would orient toward her slightly, like flowers toward a window. My father was completely devoted to her in a way that as a child I found comforting, and as an adult I find somewhat heartbreaking. Vernon was quieter, steady in a way that some people might call strength, and I've come to think of as something closer to absence. He went to work. He came home. He deferred to Loretta on everything that happened inside the house with a consistency that must have taken real effort, because I could sometimes see in his face that he disagreed, that he saw something she was doing and something in him stirred, but then nothing. He'd smooth it over, he'd look away, he'd go refill his own coffee, and the moment would pass. I loved my father. I want to be honest about that because this story isn't simple and he wasn't a monster. He was a man who had learned to keep peace in a way that cost the people around him more than it cost him, and I don't think he ever fully understood the bill he was leaving behind. Garrett was 7 years older than me. By the time I was old enough to have memories, he was already halfway out, involved in school, sports, a social life that gave him legitimate reasons to be somewhere else. I used to envy him that. I used to watch him leave the house on Saturday mornings, backpack over one shoulder, easy and unencumbered, and feel something I didn't have a word for at 8 years old. I have a word for it now. I was watching someone escape a gravity I was still trapped by, and he didn't look back. The house had rules. Not written ones, those would have been easier, more containable. These were atmospheric rules, pressure sensitive, rules you learned through the consequences of breaking them before you ever knew you had. You learned not to interrupt Loretta when she was talking, not because she told you that was a rule, but because the one time you did, at age 6. The temperature in the room changed so fast and so completely that your body cataloged it as danger and filed it away. You learned not to bring problems home unless you were prepared to defend why the problem was your fault. You learned that asking for things was acceptable, but wanting was suspect. There was one thing, though, one specific ritual, and it is the thing I have thought about more than anything else when I try to understand what Loretta was doing, consciously or not, to the children in her house. Every Sunday at dinner, my mother would produce what she called her week's accounting. I'm using her words as week's accounting. She would sit down, and she would begin, and she would go through, methodically, item by item, in a voice that was perfectly calm, almost pleasant, every mistake, misstep, social failure, or disappointment she had observed from me that week. Not Garrett, usually. Me. It might be something I'd said to a neighbor that she found embarrassing, a grade she considered insufficient, a face she'd caught me making at something she'd said, the way I'd loaded the dishwasher wrong again, the shirt I'd worn that didn't match, the fact that I'd laughed too loud at something on TV when she was trying to read. She wasn't screaming. That's what made it so hard to name for so long. She wasn't throwing things. She was sitting at the dinner table with her hands folded, and she was telling me, calmly and completely, all the ways I had been wrong that week, all the ways I had fallen short. All the evidence that I was not unloved. She never said unloved, but somehow, despite her patience, always just slightly not enough. I thought this was normal. I want to pause on that. I thought this was how families worked. I thought all mothers did this. I thought the Sunday dinner accounting was a thing, a universal thing, a parenting thing, the way some families did chores or said grace. I had no reference point that told me otherwise. And because I thought it was normal, I tried very hard to do better every week. I kept an internal list. I self-monitored. I developed, and this is not a metaphor, this is genuinely what happened. I developed this constant low-level surveillance of myself, always scanning, always checking. What did I just say? How did I just say it? Was that too much? Was that wrong? Am I about to give her something to put on the list? I was 12 years old with the internal architecture of someone bracing for an audit. There's something else. Something I'm only including because it connects to a moment later in this story that I need you to understand when it comes. I never cried at home, not in front of Loretta. Not once that I can remember after about age 8, not because I didn't feel things, I felt everything. But somewhere very early I learned that crying at home had a consequence. Not punishment exactly. More that when you cried, Loretta would look at you with this particular expression that was somehow worse than anger. Like mild, patient disappointment. Like you were being dramatic. Like the fact of your tears was evidence of the problem, not evidence that something was wrong. You stopped crying because the crying made things worse. You got very good at feeling things somewhere interior, somewhere she couldn't see, and showing nothing on the surface. I was a very calm child by all external measures. Inside, I was a kid holding absolutely everything. I met Mara in my second year of college. We were in the same literature seminar, a small class, 12 students, the kind where you can't be invisible even if you want to, where the professor knows your name by the second week and expects you to have opinions. I was not good at having opinions, or more accurately, I was not good at saying them out loud in rooms where other people might disagree, but Mara had no such problem. She was one of those people who said exactly what she thought, in exactly the words she thought it in, no preface, no apology. I found her mildly terrifying at first. I also found her riveting. There is something fascinating about watching someone do a thing you forgot was even possible. We started talking after class, then before class. Then instead of class, in the coffee shop 2 blocks from campus that never had enough seating and always had the right music. She was funny in a way that required you to actually be paying attention. She asked questions about you and then actually listened to the answers, which sounds basic but was disorienting in the way that basic things are disorienting when you've been deprived of them. One afternoon in late October, she mentioned she was driving home for the weekend, her parents' place, 40 minutes outside Millbrook, and did I want to come? She said it casually, an addendum to something else she was saying, like it was obvious. Like, of course I'd want to come. Why wouldn't I want to come? I said yes before I'd thought about it. And then I spent 3 days quiet panicking about what I had agreed to. Not because I was afraid of anything specific. Just because going to someone's house, their actual house, with their actual family, the inside of another family's private life, felt like something I had no preparation for. I didn't know the rules. I didn't know what was expected. I didn't know how to read the atmosphere of a family that wasn't mine. I'd been inside other people's homes before, of course, but always briefly, always on the surface. Birthday parties, pickups, the kind of visit where you stay in the front rooms. This was different. This was a weekend. This was staying. I almost canceled twice. I'm glad I didn't. Mara's parents' house was smaller than ours. That was the first thing I noticed. Just physically, it was a smaller house, slightly older, in a neighborhood that had that particular texture of places people actually live in, rather than places people have chosen to present. There were shoes by the front door in a pile that suggested no one had told them to be there. There was a dog, an enormous, elderly, deeply indifferent golden retriever named something I've forgotten but want to say was Gerald, which delights me every time I imagine it. There was a plant on the windowsill that was struggling but clearly loved. There were marks on the doorframe of the kitchen, where someone had been tracking children's heights, and then apparently kept going, right up into adulthood. So the line of pencil marks went from about 3 feet to almost 6, with dates next to each one. Mara's mother was named June. June came out of the kitchen when we walked in with flour on one sleeve and a dish towel over her shoulder, and she put her arms around her daughter for a long time. Not a greeting hug, a hold, the kind where you can see a person actually exhaling. Then she looked at me and said, "You must be Ren. I've heard about you." And the way she said it, warm, specific, like I was a person she'd already thought about, made something tighten in my throat for reasons I couldn't have explained. Mara's father, Ellis, was in the living room. He was reading, had reading glasses on, and when we came in, he took them off and stood up. He shook my hand and asked me one question, one specific question about where I was from, and then he actually listened to the answer and asked a follow-up. I don't know why that was remarkable to me. A man listening to a 22-year-old he'd just met. But I remember standing in that living room thinking, I need to pay attention here. Something is happening here. We helped with dinner. Or rather, Mara helped with dinner, and I stood in the kitchen being slowly undone by the atmosphere of the place, which I can only describe as easy. Things were easy in that house in a way I had no framework for. June made a comment and Ellis laughed, and the laugh was real. Not performed, not the careful social laugh I'd grown up watching adults produce at appropriate moments. They disagreed about something. I don't even remember what. Something about a neighbor, some small thing. And they disagreed without the temperature changing. Without anything becoming weaponizable. Mara interrupted her father twice, and he didn't flinch. I stood there with a knife in my hand, having been assigned to the salad, and I watched this family move around each other, and I thought, they are not being careful. That's what it was. That's what I couldn't name at first. They were not being careful with each other. There was no monitoring happening, no reading of atmospheres, no adjusting of behavior based on who was in a mood and what the mood required. They were just present, with each other, without armor. I didn't know you could do that in a family. I want to say that again because I'm not sure if you'll feel the full weight of it unless I say it plainly. I was 22 years old. I had lived in a house with people my entire life. And I genuinely did not know that families could move through space together without everyone being slightly braced, slightly monitoring, slightly managing. It was the most destabilizing thing I'd ever experienced. We sat down to dinner. June had made pot roast. She put the dish in the middle of the table, and Ellis started to serve, and the conversation just continued. They were talking about something that had happened in town, some small local story that I couldn't follow but that everyone else found funny, and there was laughter, and the laughter was easy. And Mara reached over and stole a piece of bread from the basket before her father had finished serving, and he looked at her with mock outrage, and she shrugged and took a bite, and he shook his head and smiled, and there was nothing loaded in any of it. And then Ellis reached over, without stopping what he was saying, without making it a moment, and refilled Mara's water glass. That was it. That was the thing. I felt the room tilt. I felt something go quiet inside my chest. I sat very still, and I watched Ellis set the pitcher back down and keep talking, and Mara keep eating, and June say something that made everyone laugh again, and I thought, why does this feel like I'm watching something I've been hungry for my whole life and didn't know I was hungry for? I didn't say anything for a long time after that, not because I'd been rendered mute by revelation. It wasn't that clean or that dramatic. It was more that the part of me that generates words had been temporarily overtaken by the part of me that was trying to absorb something too large for language. I answered questions when they were asked. I smiled. I ate the pot roast, which was extraordinary. But the rest of me was somewhere else entirely, sitting very still inside a large feeling, trying to figure out its dimensions. Mara glanced at me once, across the table, and raised an eyebrow. She could tell something was happening. I shook my head slightly, like I'm fine. She gave me a look that said she didn't fully believe me, but was going to let it go for now. That's the thing about Mara. She could read a room and knew when not to narrate what she saw. That takes more intelligence than most people realize. After dinner, while Ellis and June were doing the dishes, together, talking, bumping into each other in that comfortable way of people who have shared a small kitchen for 20 years and never found it worth fighting about, Mara took me out onto the back porch. It was cold. There was a string of lights along the railing someone had put up and never taken down, and they were on, and the yard beyond was dark, and we stood there with mugs of tea, and for a while, neither of us said anything. Then she said, "Are you okay?" And I said yes, and meant it, and didn't mean it. She said, "You got quiet in there." And I said I knew, and I'm sorry. And she told me not to apologize, and I said sorry again automatically, and we both noticed that, and she laughed a little, and I laughed a little, and then I said something I hadn't planned to say. I said, I didn't know families were like that. She looked at me. Like what? And I tried to explain it and couldn't. Not really. Not in a way that didn't make me sound like someone who'd been raised in a laboratory or pulled from a river. I said something about how her parents seemed easy with each other and with her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, like she was choosing words, "Is yours different?" I didn't answer right away, because the thing is, I still hadn't named it. I still thought I was describing an anomaly in Mara's family, something unusually warm that I'd been lucky to stumble into. I hadn't yet flipped the lens and considered that maybe what was unusual was mine. I said, I don't know, I think maybe I just didn't grow up with a lot of, I trailed off. I tried again. It was kind of formal, in my house. There were a lot of rules about things. She nodded like she understood something, but didn't push. We went back inside. I slept in the guest room, which had a quilt that someone had made by hand and a lamp that cast warm light and a silence that didn't feel pressurized. And I lay there in the dark and I thought about Sunday dinners. I thought about Loretta's voice, pleasant and calm, reading the list. I thought about learning to stand very still in the middle of a mood. I thought about 8-year-old me on the coast trip, practicing invisibility in the back seat. I thought about Ellis's hand on the pitcher. I didn't sleep for a long time. I went home the following weekend. Back to the beige house on the beige street, back to Vernon and Loretta, back to the house I'd grown up in. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't going back with an agenda. I wasn't going home to test anything or confront anything or measure. I was going home because it was the weekend and I did that sometimes, and also, I think somewhere in me I wanted to see it through new eyes. Wanted to see if maybe I'd been reading it wrong. I had not been reading it wrong. But I also wasn't ready to fully understand that yet. Saturday night, we were at dinner. Vernon was talking about something at work, a small thing, some office politics thing, the kind of story that you tell to fill space. And I did something I'd never really done consciously before. I watched Loretta while he talked. I watched her face. She was not unkind to him. She was not cruel. But she was somewhere else. She was present in the room and absent from him simultaneously. There was a patience in her expression that had nothing warm in it. The patience of a person who has decided the thing being said is not worth the energy of full attention, but is willing to wait for it to end. When he finished, she said something that redirected the conversation entirely, not rudely, seamlessly, as if his story had been a pause before what she actually wanted to talk about. And he let her. He always let her. I had watched that happen 1,000 times. I had never seen it before. The next morning, Sunday, I was at the table when Loretta sat down. She looked rested. Her coffee was in her hand, the good mug, the one that was implicitly hers and that no one ever used. She looked at me across the table and she said, "I made a note this week about Thanksgiving." And she began, "It wasn't the week's accounting, not exactly, not this time. It was about something I'd said on the phone the week before. Something about not being sure I could be home for the full break. Something about a paper I had to finish." She was laying out calmly and completely why what I'd said had been selfish, why it had been a disappointment, why the way I'd phrased it, the particular words I'd chosen, had communicated something about my priorities that she found troubling. I sat across from her and I listened. And for the first time in my life, I had something to measure it against. I thought about June. I thought about the way June had put her arms around Mara in the front hallway. Not a greeting, a hold. I thought about the way June had said my name like I was a person she'd already thought about. I thought about the marks on the doorframe, the struggling plant on the windowsill, the clutter of shoes by the door, all of it broadcasting something so simple it had taken me 22 years to have the evidence for. This is a house where people are welcome as they are. I sat across from Loretta and I thought, this is not what love looks like. I didn't say that. I was nowhere near ready to say that. But I thought it, for the first time, as a real thought, not a flash of anger, not a teenager's rebellion, but a cold, quiet, almost clinical observation. This is not what love looks like. That thought would take years to do its full work on me. When she finished, I said, "Okay," not as defeat, just "Okay, I'm hearing you." I put it in the file. I walked away from the table and I went up to my room and I sat on my bed and I realized something I couldn't have articulated yet, but felt completely clearly. I had just watched my own family through someone else's eyes for the first time, and I needed to figure out what to do with what I'd seen. Here's where I have to tell you something I'm not particularly proud of. When you see something clearly for the first time, something you should have been able to see all along, the initial feeling isn't liberation, or at least it wasn't for me. The initial feeling was rage, and the second feeling, right behind it, was grief. And then, because I didn't have the tools yet to do anything healthy with either of those things, I did what a lot of people do. I turned it sideways and let it come out at the wrong people. I started pulling back, not dramatically, not in a way that made us unseen or demanded an explanation, just gradually reducing my footprint. I stopped calling home as often. I stopped going back on weekends. I told myself it was self-preservation, which it partly was, but I also knew, if I'm being honest, and I'm trying to be, that there was something punitive in it too. Something that wanted everyone around me to feel the withdrawal, including Cass. I'd known Cass since freshman year. She was my closest friend, the person I ate lunch with and called when something happened, and trusted with versions of myself I didn't show anyone else. And for about 4 months after that November dinner, I was not a good friend to her. I was distracted and remote, and when she asked what was wrong, I said nothing, which was both a lie and the truth, and when she pushed, I got irritable in a way I'm not proud of. I was going through something real, but I was also using the realness of it as permission to be unkind to someone who had done nothing to deserve it. Cass, to her enormous credit, called me on it. It was February. We were in the coffee shop, the one near campus, and she set down her cup and said, "Ren, I need to tell you something." She said it the way she always said hard things. Sparse, direct, no cruelty but no cushion either. She said she'd noticed that I'd been somewhere else for months. She said she didn't know what was happening, but she knew something was happening, and she was going to keep showing up. But she needed me to at least acknowledge that I was in there somewhere. I tried to deflect. She didn't let me. I ended up telling her about that dinner, about Mara's house, about Ellis and the Waterless and the water glass and June's arms around her daughter and the marks on the doorframe. I was not eloquent about it. I cried partway through, for the first time in a long time, in front of another person, and it felt like something physically moving through me, like a stone being shifted that had been sitting in one spot long enough to leave a mark in the ground. Cass sat across from me and let me talk, and didn't try to fix it or rush it or offer the kinds of comfort that are really just requests for the discomfort to stop. When I was done, she said, "How long have you known it wasn't okay?" And I said, "I think I've known for a while and didn't have evidence." She said, "And now you do." I said, "Yes." She said, "What are you going to do with it?" I didn't have an answer, not then. But that question, "What are you going to do with it?" stayed with me. It would stay with me for years. It's the right question, and it doesn't have a quick answer, and I think anyone who tells you they had a realization about their family and then immediately took clear, healthy, productive action is skipping several chapters of the real story. The real story is messier. The real story takes longer. The real story involves going backwards sometimes, thinking you've understood something and then finding out there's another layer underneath, another room behind the room you just found. But Cass had named something, and naming things I was learning was the beginning of being able to do anything about them. I'd like to tell you about the spring of that year, because something happened in March that I've thought about almost every week since. I was in a bookstore, not buying anything, just walking through the way you do when you need to be somewhere quiet without being alone. And I picked up a book almost randomly, just a title that caught something in my eye. I don't want to name the book specifically because this isn't about the book. It's about what I read in the first chapter that made me stand in the middle of a bookstore aisle for 8 minutes without moving. The passage was about families, about how the family you grow up in is the first model of reality that you have. About how children don't know that they're being shown a model, they think they're being shown the world. And the cruelest thing about a broken model, the passage said, is that you don't discover it's broken by comparing it to a better model. You discover it's broken by going out into the world and repeatedly trying to use it in situations where it doesn't work, wondering why things keep not working, why connections keep not connecting, why the maps you were given keep leading you somewhere wrong. I stood in that bookstore aisle and I thought about the map. I thought about all the places I had navigated by it without knowing. All the times I'd preemptively apologized in conversations, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd been trained to apologize before the accusation landed. All the times I'd self-monitored in social situations, scanning, checking, adjusting, always aware of what others might be observing about me. All the times I'd told myself a feeling was too large or too inconvenient to have, had folded it up and put it in the interior space I'd built for folded up things. I thought about how I'd started sentences my whole life with "sorry but" and hadn't noticed. Cass had pointed that out to me months earlier, casually almost. We'd been talking and I'd said it, the reflex, the sorry but, and she'd looked up and said, "You know you do that constantly, right? Start things with sorry." And I'd laughed and said I knew, and I hadn't known, and I'd gone home that night and thought about it, and then set it aside because I didn't know what to do with it. Now, standing in the bookstore, I knew what it was. I knew exactly what it was. It was the physical residue of a household that had taught me that my perspective was a burden to be excused before offering. Every sentence a preemptive apology. Every opinion wrapped in sorry. A whole life's worth of performing smallness before anyone asked me to. I bought the book. I went home. I didn't read any more of it that day. I just sat with the part I'd already read. Sometimes you get to a thing in the right order and you need to give it space before you go further. There was a conversation with Garrett that summer. This one is harder to tell. I'd been avoiding extended family interaction, but Garrett happened to be back in Millbrook for a week, and we ended up having dinner, just the two of us, which was unusual. We'd never been particularly close, given the age gap and his years of elegant disappearance. But we were adults now, and I wanted to understand something, and I thought maybe he could help. I want to say that I went into that dinner trying to be fair, trying to ask questions rather than lay accusations, trying to actually listen to what he told me rather than using him as a prop in a story I was already writing. I mostly managed it. We were at a restaurant midway through the meal, and I said, "Can I ask you something about growing up? About the house?" He said sure, in the way people say sure when they're not entirely sure. I said, did you know about the Sunday dinners? About what she did every week? He was quiet for a moment. He took a drink of his water. He set the glass down very carefully. And then he said, it was different with me. She didn't do that with me as much. I said, but you knew she did it with me. He said, I was aware of it, and you never said anything. He looked at me. I could see something in his face. Not cruelty, not indifference, something more complicated. Something that looked, honestly, like a person in the presence of a thing they've been hoping wouldn't become a conversation. He said, what would I have said? To who? I said, I don't know. To me. Something. Anything. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been, and this is the word he used, the word that has stayed with me, compartmentalizing. He'd put his experience of that house in one space, and my experience in another, and found ways to not look directly at the space where the two connected. He was sorry. He knew it wasn't good enough. He said it more than once, which I think means he meant it. I told him I wasn't angry at him. And I wasn't, not exactly, not the sharp kind of anger. What I felt was more like loss. Like looking at the map again and finding another road that had been marked wrong. I had needed an ally in that house and hadn't had one, and he had been there the whole time, and he had been quiet. And I don't think he's a bad person, but I think the silence cost me something I never got back. We finished dinner. We hugged outside the restaurant. We've talked since, and things are civil, and we're building something. Slowly, carefully, like people who have decided to try, despite the awkward architecture of their history. But that dinner sits in me differently than the others. I started seeing Dr. O.C. in the fall. Not a dramatic decision, not after a breakdown or a crisis, just a decision. An acknowledgement that I was carrying things that were too heavy and too structurally load-bearing to disassemble alone, and that I needed someone who knew what they were doing to help me figure out which beams could be moved and which ones were still, for now, necessary. Dr. O.C. is an extraordinarily good therapist, and I will not describe her in detail because her details are not mine to share, but I will tell you this. The first thing she said to me that genuinely changed something was not a long or complicated thing. I was in our second or third session, and I was describing the Sunday dinners, laying it out in the even, organized, unfeeling way I'd learned to present things. And she stopped me. She said, "How old were you when that started?" I said, "I don't know. I think 8 or 9. She said, "So a child." And something about her saying it that plainly, not as analysis, not as framing, just as a statement, a child, something about that cracked a seam in the even organized presentation. I sat with it for a moment. I said yes, she said yes, we sat with it together, and then I cried. Not the kind of crying I'd done in the coffee shop with Cass, that had been relief, things moving through. This was older, this was grief. This was a 22-year-old, sitting in a soft chair, crying for the 8-year-old, who had stood very still and felt everything, and learned to show nothing. Because that was the only way to survive Sunday dinners in a house where the temperature could change without warning. I cried for a long time. It was the right thing to do. Dr. O.C. and I worked together for 2 years. I won't take you through all of it. It's mine and it's ongoing, and some of it is still sorting itself out. But I want to mark a few things that happened in that time because they're relevant to how this story ends. I learned the name for the Sunday dinners. It's not a dramatic clinical term. It's just that kind of systematic criticism of a child, delivered calmly, consistently, over years, where the parent uses their authority to inventory the child's failures on a regular schedule. That's not discipline. That's not high standards. That's a form of emotional cruelty that can be extremely hard to name, precisely because it looks, from the outside, like attentiveness, like engagement, like a parent who pays close attention. I learned that as my self-monitoring, my constant internal audit, my particular way of bracing for impact in any social situation. These weren't personality traits, they were adaptations. They were things I had built to survive a specific environment, and they had been genuinely necessary in that environment, and they had followed me out of it, and were now running in situations where they cost me more than they protected me. I learned that the absence of crying was not toughness. I learned that my map was not the world. I went back to see Mara several times over those years. Her parents' house became a place I returned to with a kind of intentionality I can't fully explain. Not obsession, but something like pilgrimage. I needed to keep seeing it. I needed to keep sitting in that kitchen with the struggling plant and the marks on the doorframe and watch June and Ellis move through their days. I needed the evidence. Not because I needed to be convinced my family was wrong, I was past that, but because I needed models. I had been working with a broken map for 22 years, and I needed to look at things that worked and learn from them. June, I eventually realized, had figured out something I'd never seen demonstrated in my own home. She had figured out that loving someone and approving of everything they do are not the same thing. That you can be genuinely disappointed in a choice a person made and still communicate that you believe in them, that they are fundamentally safe with you, that the disappointment is about the action and not about them as a human being. It is not simple. It is one of the harder things a parent has to learn to do, and many never do it, and the children of those parents carry the cost their whole lives. Ellis had figured out that presence is different from performance. He actually attended to people, without making an event of it. The water glass. A hand on a shoulder while passing through, a question followed by an actual answer followed by a follow-up question. Nothing cinematic, everything real. He was not a man who said much about love. He was a man who made the people around him feel like there was enough air in the room. I want to be careful not to turn them into symbols. They were just people. They had problems and frictions and, I'm sure, struggles I wasn't privy to. They weren't perfect. But they were present in a way that felt, to me, like what families are supposed to be. Like what I was supposed to have had. There's a grief in that. I want to say that plainly. Seeing something you were supposed to have and didn't is not a neutral experience. There's an anger in it first, and then, eventually, underneath the anger, there's grief. For the child you were, for the years you spent navigating a broken map, for the things you didn't know you were missing because you didn't know to miss them. I sat with that grief for a long time. Dr. Osi helped me figure out that you don't have to rush through it. The grief isn't the problem. The grief is actually appropriate. It's the right response to something real having been lost. And when you've spent your whole life suppressing appropriate responses to real things, learning to let the grief be what it is turns out to be its own form of healing. I want to tell you about the last time I went home. Not the last time ever. I've been back since, briefly, for things that required it. But the last time I went home without a specific plan to have a specific conversation, the last time I walked in expecting things to be more or less what they'd always been. I was 25. It was Christmas. Garrett was there, and a few other family members, the peripheral ones who appeared at holidays and maintained the surface of the family the way paint maintains the surface of a wall. Loretta had made the house beautiful. She was always good at that, at the aesthetics of things, at the surfaces, and the table was set immaculately, and there was food, and there was music. And from the outside, you would have looked at it and thought, that's lovely. That's a family Christmas. I sat at that table, and I was different. I was different in myself from every previous Christmas because I had 2 years of therapy in me and Cass and Dr. Ozi and all those evenings at Mara's parents' house and a long, slow process of learning to trust my own perceptions. And so I sat there and I saw things I would have once not seen or not let myself see. I watched my mother silence my father at dinner. Not loudly, not obviously, just the particular way she had of talking over the end of his sentences when she'd decided his point was made, or redirecting the conversation away from something he'd said as if he hadn't said it, so smoothly that he seemed not to notice. Except I caught something on his face once, a flicker. He had noticed, he just didn't say so. I watched Garrett navigate the evening with the practiced ease of someone who has learned the choreography of this particular performance and no longer has to think about his steps. He was charming and funny and present in the way of a person who is also slightly somewhere else, and I recognized it because I used to do the same thing. And I watched Loretta at the head of her table in her beautiful house, running the evening with the capable, calm authority she'd always had, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt sad for her. Not in place of anger. The anger was still there. It lives there. I'm not going to tell you I moved past it because that would be a lie. But alongside it, for the first time, was something that recognized her as a person who had been shaped before she started shaping me. I had learned, in the years since that November dinner, a few things about Loretta's own childhood. Not a lot. She didn't speak about it freely, which is itself a thing, but enough to know that the house she'd grown up in had not been kind either. Enough to know that she had been given a map too, and her map was broken too, and she had used the only tools she had the way people use the only tools they have. I'm not saying that excuses anything. It doesn't. A broken map that was given to you is still a broken map if you hand it to your child. The origin doesn't change the damage. But I sat at that Christmas table, and I looked at my mother and I saw, for the first time, the woman inside the role, a person who had never been told that the way she was raised wasn't the only way, who had never had an Ellis at a Tuesday night dinner table demonstrating that presence is different from performance, who had never had a cast to sit across from her and say, "With love and without cruelty, you know you do that constantly, right?" She had never had that. I had it. That wasn't nothing. The conversation with Loretta happened the following spring. I want to be careful about how I tell this because I think people expect these conversations to be cinematic. The big confrontation, the accusations, the tearful admission, the resolution. I've watched enough TV to know that's the shape we've been trained to expect. And I want to be honest. It wasn't like that. It was a phone call. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon. I had thought about it for weeks. I had talked to Dr. Osi about it, and Cass and I had decided at some point that I did not need the conversation to produce a specific outcome to justify having it. I wasn't calling to extract an apology or a confession or a transformation. I was calling because I had things I needed to say, and carrying them unspoken was costing me more than the risk of saying them. I told her about the Sunday dinners. I told her I had understood for a long time that they were normal, that I had thought they were a thing all families did. I told her that I understood now that they weren't. I told her what those dinners had done to me, not dramatically, not with a list of grievances, but honestly. The self-monitoring, the apologies, the way I'd spent years braced. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. I waited. She said, "I didn't realize you experienced it that way," which is a sentence that could be a genuine statement of ignorance or a deflection dressed as one. And I genuinely don't know which it was for her in that moment. I think, and this is my honest best guess, it was somewhere between them. I think some part of what I was describing was genuinely new information to her, and I think some part of her had known and had found ways not to look at it. The way Garrett had found ways not to look at it, the way we all find ways not to look at certain things. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "My mother did something similar every Friday evening," and then she stopped. Like she'd said something she hadn't meant to say or hadn't meant to say yet, or wasn't sure what to do with now that it was out. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it. I thought about the map and who had handed it to her and who had handed it to that person and how far back the chain went. I thought about the Christmas table and the woman inside the role. I thought about 2 years of therapy and the word grief. I said, "I'm sorry that happened to you." And I meant it. That's the strange thing. I meant it fully. Right alongside the anger, right alongside the hurt, right alongside 25 years of Sunday dinners and bracing and smallness. I meant it. Because she was handed a broken map too. Because she was a child once. Because the fact that she carried the damage forward doesn't mean she deserved the damage in the first place. She cried a little. I could hear it. I did not tell her everything was okay because it isn't fully, and I didn't want to offer her a false resolution that would let us both step back from a real one. I told her I needed things to be different. I told her what different meant, in specific terms, the Sunday dinner logic whenever it appeared, the systematic inventory of failures. I told her I wasn't going to be available for those conversations anymore. She said she understood. I don't know if she did, fully. I don't know if she's capable of it, fully, or if it's too built in, too old, too foundational to what she's always believed about what parenting means. Our relationship is different now. Careful in a different way. Not the careful of bracing, but the careful of people who have acknowledged something and are trying to figure out how to go forward. It's not what I would have chosen if I were starting from nothing, but I'm not starting from nothing. Nobody is. We're all somewhere in the middle of the story, trying to figure out which way forward leads somewhere worth going. I want to come back to Mara. We've stayed friends, good friends, the kind who know the architecture of each other and work with it. I told her eventually about everything, about what that first dinner had done to me, about the conversations that followed, about the years in between. She listened with the same quality she'd always listened with, full and unhurried, without making it about herself, without trying to fix what didn't need fixing. At the end, she said, "I'm glad you were there that night." I told her I was glad too. I went back to her parents' house once more 2 years ago, just for an afternoon, a Sunday. June made lunch. Ellis had acquired a second dog, equally enormous, slightly less indifferent. We sat at the kitchen table, the same light coming through the same windows, and Mara told some story that made her mother laugh, the real laugh, the one with the whole face. And Ellis looked at his daughter across the table, and the look on his face was, there's no word. There's no single word for the way a parent looks at a child when they are fully present with the fact of the child, when they are in no performance, when they are just glad of the person across from them. I know what I was missing when I saw it. I know it in my body now. I didn't cry at that table. I had done enough crying for what was lost. What I felt that afternoon, sitting in that kitchen with those people and that old dog and that light, I think the word might be grateful. Grateful that I had stumbled in here at 22, unable to name what I was feeling. Grateful that a water glass had cracked something open that needed to be cracked open. Grateful for Cass and Dr. Osi and Mara and Ellis's particular patient presence and June's arms around her daughter in the front hallway. Grateful for the evidence, for finally having something to measure against. I live alone now in an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that has a window that catches the afternoon light in a way I find absurdly satisfying. I have a plant that's doing better than June's did. I have a small table in the kitchen where I have my coffee in the mornings, and on Sunday mornings I sit there and I do not have a week's accounting. I sat there this past Sunday with my coffee going slightly cold, and I thought about this story, about all the years between that first dinner and now, about the map and the breaking of it and the slow, non-cinematic work of drawing a new one, about what it costs to see something clearly that you've been protected from seeing for a long time, about the specific and particular grief of understanding what you were supposed to have. I thought about a thing Cass had said to me, years ago now, back in the coffee shop when she'd called me out of my 4-month fog. She said, I think, I'm paraphrasing, she said something about how the damage of a thing and the overcoming of it aren't in a race. You don't have to be done being hurt before you can start being okay. You can hold them at the same time. I've thought about that a lot. I thought about Loretta's voice, calm and methodical, reading the list. I thought about how long I believed that was normal. I thought about 8-year-old me and all the things she was holding. I thought about Ellis and the water glass and how a completely ordinary act of quiet care can blow a hole in someone's reality if that person has never seen it before. And then I realized, some sitting there, coffee cold, Sunday morning, my own quiet kitchen, I realized I hadn't started a single sentence with sorry all week. Not once. Not a reflex, not a preface, not a piece of smallness offered before anyone asked for it. I sat with that for a minute. It felt like something, quiet and large and mine. I had been so busy surviving my family that I never noticed I hadn't learned how to live. I'm learning now. It doesn't look the way I thought it would. It's not clean or complete or resolved. There are still Sundays that are complicated and phone calls that cost something, and moments when the old mapping flickers back, when I catch myself bracing for a temperature change in a room where the temperature is actually fine. Recovery isn't a destination, I've learned. It's more like a direction, a continued choosing of the direction that leads toward air, toward presence, toward rooms where people move without armor. I still think about that dinner. I think about it the way you think about the moment you saw something true for the first time. Not because it was perfect, or because Mara's family is a model without cracks, or because watching someone else's love will fix what was missing in yours, but because that was the moment the map and the territory stopped matching. Because that was the moment I got evidence. Because that was the moment some part of me woke up in the middle of a stranger's kitchen and realized, I have been hungry for this my whole life. And then went home to find out why. If you're watching this and you recognize any part of what I've been describing, the bracing, the self-monitoring, the apologizing before you've said anything worth apologizing for, the Sunday dinners of one kind or another, I want you to know something. You're not too sensitive, you're not misremembering, you're not making it larger than it is. What you felt was real. What you saw was real. You saw exactly what you thought you saw. And whatever map you were handed, it's not the world. The world is larger than that. Go find out how large.